She was holding the hand of the man she had loved for 21 years, the father of her daughters, the keeper of every dream she had ever allowed herself to have, when she asked him the one question that detonated their entire marriage. "How long have you known?" The courtroom went silent, the kind of silence that doesn't fall. It crashes. Every person in those oak pews felt the floor tilt beneath them because they could see it in his face before he answered. They could see the 21 years of marriage collapsing into a single, trembling breath. Her name is Lorraine Caldwell, and the man beside her is Ethan Caldwell, a name she had worn like a crown for 2 decades, the same name that had been stamped on the falsified safety report that killed her father in 1967. Let me take you back to Detroit. Back to the summer of 1967, when the city was days away from erupting, and a man named James Hayward was about to walk into a steel mill for the last time. James was 34 years old, broad shoulders, kind eyes, the kind of man other men stepped aside for in a hallway, not because they were afraid of him, but because he carried himself like a man who knew exactly who he was. He had been a steel worker at the Riverbend plant for 11 years. He was respected on the line. He was needed on the line, and he had a wife at home, Rose, and a baby girl named Lorraine, who had just learned to clap her hands. James had one rule in his house: you do not let the world inside these walls. The Riverbend plant was run by men who looked at him like furniture, who handed him the dirtiest shifts in the coldest corners of the floor, who called him boy to his face and worse behind his back. But James never brought it home. He walked through that front door, scooped Lorraine onto his shoulder, and became a man without a bruise, until the day Arthur Caldwell's negligence turned a routine shift into a grave. Arthur Caldwell was the plant foreman, white, connected, the kind of man whose handshake was a contract and whose silence was always for sale. He had ignored the maintenance reports. He had signed off on a brake inspection that had never happened. And when the forklift rolled, when the steel beam swung, when James Hayward's body hit the concrete floor with a sound the other workers would never forget, Arthur Caldwell did not call the medics first. He called his lawyer. The official report called it a forklift malfunction. The signature on the falsified safety log belonged to Arthur Caldwell, and the settlement check, small, bloodless, insultingly neat, was delivered to Rose Hayward's front door with a single instruction: stay quiet or lose everything. Rose stayed quiet for 57 years. This is the story of the daughter he left behind, the son who inherited the lie, and the marriage that was built, brick by brick, on a murder no one was supposed to survive. The morning James Hayward died, he kissed Lorraine on the forehead and told Rose he would be home by 6. He said it the way he said it every morning, like a promise, not a sentence. Rose watched him walk down the porch steps, his lunch pail in one hand, his dignity in the other, and she never thought to call him back. The Riverbend plant was a fortress of iron and secrets. By 1967, the city of Detroit was coiled tight. The summer unrest was 3 days away, and you could feel it in the air. In the way white men crossed the street, in the way black men kept their hands visible, in the way the factory whistle sounded less like a shift change and more like a warning. James had worked at Riverbend through all of it. He had been promoted exactly once in 11 years, and even that promotion had cost him a friend who accused him of forgetting where he came from. He hadn't forgotten. He just had a daughter to feed. Arthur Caldwell had been foreman for 6 months. He had inherited the position from a man who had died of a heart attack on the floor, and nobody at Riverbend ever talked about it. Arthur wore a white hard hat on a floor where every other supervisor wore yellow. He drove a Cadillac to a plant where the workers took the bus, and he treated the safety reports like suggestions, not laws. The forklift had been flagged twice. The brake line was cracked. The replacement part had been sitting in a supply closet for 9 weeks, waiting for a signature that Arthur never gave. James had mentioned it to his shift lead. His shift lead had mentioned it to Arthur. And Arthur had laughed and said, That crate has been holding for 30 years. It'll hold one more day. One more day. On July 21st, 1967, 2 days before Detroit erupted, the crate did not hold. The forklift rolled backward, the steel beams swung, and James Hayward, husband, father, the warmest man on the line, was gone before he hit the ground. The other workers tried to reach him. 2 of them, both black, both veterans of that floor, both men who had watched James eat his lunch every day for a decade, dropped to their knees beside him. One of them pressed his palm to the wound and felt the blood run warm between his fingers. The other one looked up at Arthur Caldwell, who was standing 10 feet away, white as the hard hat on his head, and said, "You did this." Arthur did not flinch. He looked at the man, looked at the body, looked at the paperwork on his clipboard, and made the only decision he had ever really known how to make. He chose himself. By midnight, the safety report had been rewritten. By morning, the witness statements had been collected and quietly paid for in cash in a back booth at a diner on Woodward Avenue. By the time Rose Hayward received a phone call from a man she had never met, telling her there had been an accident and her husband had not survived, the version of events had already been sealed in ink she would never be allowed to read. The settlement check arrived 2 weeks later. $3,000. Rose stared at it so long her eyes burned. She thought about burning it. She thought about marching down to the plant and screaming Arthur Caldwell's name into the wind. She thought about all the ways a woman can be brave in this country and still go to bed hungry. She cashed the check. She put the money in a savings account she never touched, and she raised her daughter to be everything James would have wanted her to be. If she had to do it alone in a city that was about to catch fire. 26 years passed. And then, in the basement of a building he had no business being in, a young man named Ethan Caldwell opened a cardboard box that was about to destroy his life. It was 1993. Ethan was 22, a quiet political science student at the University of Michigan, the only son of Arthur Caldwell, a man who had, by then, become something close to untouchable. Arthur had parlayed his foreman's salary into a regional steel supply empire. He had moved the family to Grosse Pointe. He had donated to the right campaigns. He had, in the precise arithmetic of post-war Detroit, risen. The Riverbend plant had been sold. The workers had been laid off. The other foreman had been quietly retired or quietly bought. And Arthur Caldwell had built himself a country club life on a foundation no one was allowed to inspect. Ethan was not like his father. That was the first thing anyone ever said about him. At school, at home, at the country club bar where Arthur liked to drink Manhattans and refer to his son as the idealist. Ethan was gentle. He voted Democrat. He read books about labor history, and he had a habit, which his father found deeply irritating, of asking questions no one in the Caldwell family was supposed to ask. The basement office belonged to one of Arthur's oldest business partners, a man who had just died suddenly, and whose widow had asked Ethan to help sort through decades of archived company records. Ethan had said yes because he was a good son. He had not expected to find anything, but on the third afternoon, in a box marked R, 1965-1972, he found a manila folder. No label, just a date in the corner, 7/21/67, and a single page of a safety report with his father's signature on the bottom line. He read it. Then he read it again. Then he read the witness statements clipped to the back. 3 of them. 2 of them paid for. 1 of them unsigned, written in a hand so shaky the ink had bled through the paper. The brake line had been flagged. The foreman had been notified. The foreman had done nothing. Ethan's hands started to shake. He felt the room tilt. He sat down on the floor of the basement office, the file in his lap, and he read the name at the top of the report. James Hayward, deceased. Age 34. Steelworker. Father of 1. He was 22 years old. He understood, in the kind of clarity that arrives once in a lifetime, that his father's money The country club, the cars, the college fund, the entire architecture of his life was built on a dead man's bones. He drove to his father's house that night. He put the file on the kitchen table, and he said, "Dad, what is this?" Arthur Caldwell looked at the file. He did not pick it up. He did not open it. He looked at his son with the same flat, evaluating stare he had used on every worker who had ever asked him a difficult question on the line. "That," Arthur said, "is a settled matter." Ethan said, "A man died." Arthur said, "Men die in plants every day. That's what plants are." Ethan said, "You knew the brake was broken." Arthur picked up his glass. He took a long, slow sip, and then he said the words that would define his son's entire life. "If you ever bring this up again, you will not be a Caldwell anymore, and you will not have a dime of what I have built." Ethan sat in that kitchen for an hour. The file sat between them. The refrigerator hummed, and somewhere in a small house on the east side of Detroit, a woman named Lorraine Hayward was finishing a 12-hour shift in the emergency room, not yet knowing that the man she was going to marry had just held her father's death in his hands. Ethan folded the file. He put it in a box. He carried the box to his closet, and he buried it under winter coats he never wore, in a house paid for by the man who had decided which safety reports were worth following and which ones were not. He told himself he would tell the right person someday. He never did. 5 years later, in 1998, at a community fundraiser in downtown Detroit, Lorraine Hayward met the man who would become her husband. She noticed him before he noticed her. He was standing near the back of the room, holding a glass of wine he had not touched, watching a jazz quartet like he was trying to memorize the song. He was tall. He was quiet. He had a face that looked like it had been designed to apologize for something. Lorraine was 28. She had been an ER nurse at Detroit Receiving for 6 years. She had raised herself in a way. Her mother Rose had loved her fiercely, but Rose had been a woman hollowed out by a grief she refused to name, and Lorraine had learned very young that the only person who was going to protect Lorraine Hayward was Lorraine Hayward. She was sharp. She was guarded. She was exhausted by the kind of men who looked at her like she was a story they could rewrite. And then she looked at Ethan Caldwell. He crossed the room. He introduced himself. He said, "I'm Ethan. I don't really know why I'm here, honestly. My father's on the board." And Lorraine laughed, a real laugh, the kind she had forgotten she could make, and said, "My mother is a janitor at the venue. She told me to come take the free food." He laughed too. He had a real laugh too. They talked for 3 hours. He told her about political science. She told him about a patient she had saved that week. He walked her to her car. He asked for her number. And when he called the next day, he did not mention his father's name, and she did not ask. He was gentle. He was wealthy. He listened like every word she said was a gift. And over the next 3 years, Lorraine, slowly, cautiously, like a woman stepping onto ice she had been warned about, let herself fall in love with him. They married in 2001. The wedding was small. Rose came and cried the entire time, holding Lorraine's hand like she was afraid someone would take it back. Arthur did not come. He sent a check. Twin daughters followed in 2004, Sophia and Miriam. 2 little girls with their mother's laugh and their father's quiet eyes. The family moved to a house in Bloomfield Hills. Ethan took over a wing of his father's business, just the clean stuff, he told Lorraine, and she believed him because she had no reason not to. For 20 years, they built a perfect life. Sunday dinners, school recitals, a vacation home in Traverse City. Lorraine earned her master's and became a charge nurse. Ethan became a partner at the firm. The girls grew up straight and smart and loved, and every single day, Ethan Caldwell carried a box in his closet like a stone in his chest. He had moved it 3 times. Once when they got married. Once when they bought the house. Once when Sophia asked if she could borrow a winter coat and he said no, too quickly, in a voice that made Lorraine look up from her book. But the box stayed, and the secret stayed, and the dead man stayed. In the spring of 2024, Rose Hayward was admitted to Detroit Receiving with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 weeks. She lasted 9. And in those 9 weeks, Lorraine sat beside her mother's bed every single night, holding her hand, brushing the silver hair from her face, watching a woman she had loved her whole life slowly, softly disappear. Rose had not been a talker. She had been a worker. She had raised Lorraine alone on a hospital salary and a savings account she would never explain. She had taught her daughter to stand up straight, to speak clearly, to never let a man make her feel small. And she had taught her, without ever saying it out loud, that some doors you do not open, because what is behind them is worse than what is in front of you. But on the 8th week, with the morphine thick in her veins and her daughter's hand in hers, Rose opened the door. She told Lorraine everything. The phone call, the settlement, the lawyer, the diner on Woodward Avenue, the signature at the bottom of the safety report. Arthur Caldwell, Rose whispered. The foreman. He killed your father, baby. He killed him, and they paid me to be quiet. And I was quiet because I was scared, and I have been scared for 57 years. Lorraine's blood turned to ice. She felt her heart stop, not slow down, stop. And then start again, hammering, slamming against her ribs like it was trying to break out of her chest. The room began to spin. The beeping of the monitors sounded like it was coming from underwater. She gripped her mother's hand so hard, Rose winced. "Mama," Lorraine said. "Mama, what did you say?" Rose was crying now. The tears slid down the creases of her face and disappeared into the pillow. "I should have told you. I should have told you the day you brought that boy home. I saw the name on the mailbox. I saw it, Lorraine. I saw Caldwell, and I didn't say a word." Lorraine drove home from the hospital at 2 a.m. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to pull over twice. She sat in the parked car in her own driveway for 40 minutes, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, and thought about her husband. Her Ethan, the man who had held her through the stillbirth scare with Sophia. The man who had read to the twins every night for 15 years. The man who had cried at her mother's kitchen table the day Rose had told him he was family. She went inside. The house was dark. The twins were asleep upstairs. And Ethan was in the study doing paperwork, looking up at her with the soft, concerned eyes she had fallen in love with in 1998. "Hey," he said, "how is she?" Lorraine looked at him, and for the first time in 21 years of marriage, she did not recognize the man sitting in front of her. She went upstairs. She opened her laptop. She typed in Arthur Caldwell in Riverbend Plant in 1967, and within 10 minutes, she was looking at her father-in-law's obituary in the Detroit Free Press, a glowing, sanitized 2-page tribute to a beloved industrialist and philanthropist who had died in 2009, surrounded by his family. His family. His son. She sat on the edge of the bed. The laptop screen lit her face in the dark. And then, with hands that would not stop shaking, she walked down the hall to the guest closet where the winter coat still sat in a box Ethan had never let anyone touch. She opened the box. She found the manila folder. And she read the witness statements, the safety report, the signature, the date, 7/21/67, and the name at the top, James Hayward. Deceased, age 34. Her father, who had kissed her on the forehead the morning he died. Her father, who had never held her hand again. Ethan appeared in the doorway. He had heard her open the closet. He had known the moment he saw her face what she had found. And Lorraine looked up at him, the folder in her trembling hands, and asked him the question that detonated their entire marriage. "How long have you known?" He did not answer for a long time. His lips moved, his eyes filled, and then he said, in a voice so small it barely made it across the room, "Since before we met. Lorraine did not sleep in their bed that night. She did not sleep in their bed for 31 nights. She moved into a hotel. She hired a civil rights attorney named Marcus Webb, and she filed a wrongful death suit against the estate of Arthur Caldwell. The lawsuit did not name Ethan. The lawsuit did not need to. The Caldwell name carried the weight of a 57-year-old lie, and once Lorraine's attorney pulled the right threads, the entire tapestry began to unravel. Marcus Webb subpoenaed the original witness statements. He tracked down the 2 surviving workers from the River Bend floor. He found the maintenance log with Arthur's signature on the day of the death, and he found, buried in the state archives, an OSHA complaint that had been filed the week before James Hayward died. A complaint about the exact brake line that had failed, signed by 3 workers, and quietly buried by a regulator who had, it turned out, played golf with Arthur Caldwell for 20 years. The trial began in October 2024. The Caldwell Family Foundation sent its lawyers. The press filled the back rows. And every morning, for 11 days, Lorraine Caldwell walked into that courtroom in a black dress and sat down at the plaintiff's table with the photo of her father, 24 years old, smiling in a hard hat, in her hand. Ethan was not in the defendant's box. He was not on the Caldwell side. He was sitting behind Lorraine, in the 3rd row, in a suit he had bought the week before, with a face that looked like it had been hollowed out from the inside. On the 7th day, the Caldwell lawyers rested. They had presented Arthur's charity work. They had presented his business record. They had presented, with a kind of polished grief, the man Arthur had been in his final decades. Marcus Webb stood up. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at Ethan Caldwell. "Call your next witness," he said. Ethan stood. The room went quiet. He walked to the witness stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. And then, in a voice that shook the way his hands had shaken 22 years earlier in his father's kitchen, Ethan Caldwell did what his father had told him would unmake him. He told the truth. He read the witness statements aloud. He read the maintenance log. He read the OSHA complaint. He named his father. He read the bribe. He read the cover-up. He read the name at the top of the report, James Hayward, my wife's father. And his voice broke on the word, wife. And he pressed his hand to his mouth, and the courtroom sat in the kind of silence that does not fall. It crashed. The verdict came down 3 days later. The Caldwell estate was found liable. The company assets were seized. The family foundation collapsed under the weight of its own filings. The country club membership was revoked. The name, Caldwell, which had been stamped on buildings and plaques and scholarships across the state of Michigan, was stripped from every one of them. And Lorraine Hayward Caldwell did not get everything. She got something money cannot buy. She got the truth on record. On a cold morning in November, Lorraine drove to the cemetery on Woodward Avenue. She walked past the rows of stones until she reached the small, weathered marker that read, James Hayward, husband, father, steelworker. Beside it, in a plot that had been empty for 57 years, was a new headstone. Rose Hayward, 1939-2024. She kept the secret. Her daughter kept the truth. Lorraine knelt. She placed her hand on her father's stone. The granite was cold, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. "I found him, Daddy," she whispered. "I found the man who did it, and I found the man who knew. And I'm still here." Ethan was waiting in the car. He had not come to the grave. He had not been invited. He had not known until that morning if he would ever be welcome at the side of his wife again. Lorraine stood. She brushed the dirt from her knees. She walked back to the car. She opened the passenger door. She sat down. And she looked at the man she had loved for 21 years, the father of her daughters, the keeper of every dream. And she said, "You chose me. Late, but you chose me." Ethan started to cry. Not the way men cry in courtrooms. The way men cry when they have finally understood what they almost lost. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He had said it 100 times in the last 31 days, and Lorraine had heard him. He said instead, "I will spend the rest of my life earning this." Lorraine took his hand. Forgiveness in this family was not free. It was not a gift. It was a debt. And Ethan Caldwell was finally, at last, willing to pay it. The lesson of this story is older than the steel mills and the courtrooms and the country clubs. It is this: the truth does not need your permission to arrive. It does not need your timeline. It does not care how long you have carried the lie. It will come for the people who buried it, and it will come for the people who inherited it. And the only question that matters, the only question that ever mattered, is which side of it you choose to stand on. James Hayward did not get to choose, but his daughter did. And that brings us to you. Have you ever kept a family secret? One you thought was protecting someone you loved, one you told yourself you would tell someday, one you buried in a box at the back of a closet, until that secret became a weight you could not carry and a lie you could not undo. We want to hear from you. Leave it in the comments. Not the names, not the details that would hurt someone. Just the moment you realized the secret had grown bigger than the love it was hiding behind. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We publish new stories every week, and every one of them is built on the same promise. The truth will out, the lie will collapse, and the people who choose love over bloodline are the ones who get to write the ending. We will see you in the next one.